Okay, here we are to talk about the chapter 29 of your AMSCO textbook. This is the transition into the Nixon presidency and the transition from the 1960s to the 1970s, 1969 to 1980. This is a time period, obviously, a lot longer than just Nixon's presidency, but one that is definitely the chapter focuses on Nixon's presidency. A series of images of Nixon here, young Nixon, Nixon as president, Nixon resigning, that he throws up the peace signs and exits the White House lawn and the helicopter. And then this is a tattoo of Richard Nixon on Roger Stone's back. Roger Stone, who was recently indicted for all kinds of things, a political operative. So he'd be showing that off in jail pretty soon. We will go forward here and look at an overview of Nixon's political style, Vietnam, his domestic policy, his political philosophy, and then, of course, looking at the bigger picture, Watergate, and then into the his resignation and the presidency of Jimmy Carter. It is described as historian Arthur Schlesinger as an imperial presidency. This refers primarily to his foreign policy, but also to a dramatic expansion of executive power that happens under Nixon. In a lot of ways, Nixon is connected to Roosevelt with respect to the expanding size of the federal government, the expanding power of the federal government, and increasingly the expanding power of the president. So what we have at the beginning of Roosevelt is a whole new deal, as it were, with respect to how much power the president has. Nixon is kind of the end of that line, with Watergate being the kind of most prominent example of what can go wrong when a president has a lot of power. Henry Kissinger is an architect of a lot of his foreign policy. Henry Kissinger is he's not convicted, but certainly many could argue successfully. One could argue that he is a war criminal. More on that later. Some people think he's a real political genius. This happened in a debate recently, actually in 2016, between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, where Hillary Clinton was highlighting her relationship to Henry Kissinger and how smart he is on foreign policy decisions. And Sanders said, well, I certainly do not count him as a friend, and then alluded to the fact of some of the things that he had done, which are not nice. Détente. This is another element of Nixon's presidency. Détente is a reducing of tensions, primarily with the Soviet Union and, of course, with China. Let's look at a scorecard. The wins, foreign policy. China's a big one. Trade with China, opening up China to trade. As suggested in your book, Nixon was probably one of the only ones who could do this and not be accused of being soft on communism because of his communist paranoia that kind of defined his early career. The strategic arms limitation talks, which reduce arms proliferation between the United States and the Soviet Union. And, of course, the L's, big L for Watergate. It really is the defining moment in his political career. The War Powers Act, which, because of Henry Kissinger's policies in Cambodia, limits the power of the executive during wartime. Tough on crime. It's fine to be tough on crime, but Nixon is the beginning of the mass incarceration that will continue up through the 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s, and really only now is being discussed in a bipartisan way by the United States government. A couple of years ago, actually, to kind of point to this fact, a op-ed was published in the New York Times that was co-authored by Rand Paul, who is on the far right of the Senate, and Kamala Harris, who is on the left, is a Democrat at least. She's not certainly far left, but it shows you that both of them were saying we need to reform criminal justice. Rand Paul, the libertarian perspective that this is too much power over people's lives that the prisons have, and that Kamala Harris saying it disproportionately targets African Americans and things like that. Stuff that just happened. The political realignment, also known as the Southern Strategy. Nixon takes full advantage of this. but he doesn't make it. Any Republican president probably would have taken advantage of this realignment of the political spectrum. The war on drugs, this is something, again, that just he takes advantage of it with the tough on crime legislation, but it is bigger than him. And then some bad economic luck. Presidents can affect the economy to some degree, certainly with policies they pass, but in terms of the larger ebb and flow of the economy, don't have much control over that, and Nixon has a bad one. His paranoid politics. Again, he comes to power and it comes into the national spotlight because of his paranoia about communists. In 1968, what does he do here? LBJ wants a quick peace treaty with the Vietnamese to help Hubert Humphreys. He doesn't get it, largely because Nixon sent an aide, H.R. Haldeman, to say to the North Vietnamese to not negotiate until after the election. Excuse me, South Vietnamese, not North Vietnamese. And then they do negotiate after Nixon wins the election. And then, of course, his dirty tricks. Right, his re-election committee is the acronym CREEP, so that's a bad sign of things to come there. Burglarizing both the Democratic National Committee's headquarters at the Watergate Hotel and the home office of Daniel Ellsberg. Anyone who has an enemies list is probably closer to villain than to hero. And then, of course, he records all the meetings in the Oval Office, which is a mistake. He does it with the hope of catching other people out in things that they would say, and it ends up catching him out. Nixon's story is actually it's a political tragedy, really, because he obviously, vice president under Eisenhower, loses to Kennedy in 1960, and then he's kind of off the map. It's what do you do at that point? He's not really seen as a viable political candidate anymore, and he comes back and he wins. It really is one of the greatest political turnarounds certainly in modern history. And he had a lot of very interesting policies, certainly, if you give him credit. However, right, everything is overshadowed by all the kind of nasty stuff that he did. Okay, Vietnam. Vietnamization is not like, it sounds like things are becoming more Vietnamese, and in some degree they are, because Vietnam is in charge of more of the war effort and less American intervention is needed. So U.S. is drawing down forces and then channeling funds to other countries. So that's Vietnamization. It's a little confusing because it sounds like, like things that like Garden Grove becoming Vietnamese or something in the 1970s after the Vietnam War, but it's actually Vietnam taking more control over their own war efforts. South Vietnam, that is. Massive Vietnam bombing of North Vietnam, and then, as I mentioned earlier, Operation Menu, which is the carpet bombing of Cambodia, long-lasting even to this day. There are health effects in Cambodia because of the massive bombing of both incendiary bombs and defoliants, so Agent Orange and other defoliants that would get rid of, have all the trees drop their leaves and all the plants die. So major health consequences for the Vietnamese or the Cambodian population because of this. Again, another one of the things that potentially could be cited in calling Henry Kissinger a war criminal is a massive carpet bombing of a country that you are not at war with. And then covering up atrocities like My Lai. My Lai does not happen on Nixon's watch. It's under LBJ. But because the public finds out about it while Nixon is president, he's kind of left holding the scandal, as it were. Domestic policy. Tough on crime. This is what it leads to. The beginning of a massive spike in incarceration rates that begins in Nixon's war on drugs years. What is all the crime about? It really is, the tough on crime is less about break-ins and petty theft and arson or even homicide, as much as it is the massive waves of violence that were happening in the 1960s on a larger scale, right? So African Americans that are demanding civil rights in the North and acting out against things like the assassination of Martin Luther King. There's a series of riots after that. Reacting against police brutality. There's a riot in Detroit because of that. This is when Nixon says tough on crime, he's really referring to the quote unquote crime of all of this urban unrest that's happening. It's not just like average crime. Part of this is the war on drugs, people selling drugs. Why is there a war on drugs? Because people are using drugs. But why? Why are people using drugs in this time period? And Nixon, again, Nixon, if you look at recorded interviews with Nixon in this time period, he's fairly savvy here, right? He himself asked the question, right? There has to be, why are people turning to drugs to alleviate their pain? There has to be some underlying issue that they're dealing with. He's very, very progressive in some ways with respect to war on drugs. There's economic decline. People are losing their jobs in cities throughout the North and cities in the West. Jobs that were once okay blue-collar jobs no longer exist. So people are using drugs to escape their economic problems. People are selling drugs to create new economic opportunities. So this is part of what begins to happen in the 1970s. A lot of veterans returning from Vietnam are what they wouldn't have called then, but what we know is post-traumatic stress disorder or syndrome. They have seen and sometimes done really terrible things, and they need to deal with that trauma somehow. And many of them turn to drugs. Many of them are actually addicted even before they return home. Heroin being very widely available in Southeast Asia, so they started using while they were actually in the service. Nixon, again, however, very progressive. He allocates more money for prevention and treatment than for law enforcement. So we do see this incarceration trend go up. But Nixon understood that the treatment programs and the prevention programs were more successful than just locking people up. Subsequent presidents did not do that. Reagan, Bush, and Clinton, for example, increasingly allocated money towards law enforcement, lock them up, throw away the key kind of legislation. Economic stuff, new federalism. Again, this is not Eisenhower's conservatism. This is far more conservative than Eisenhower. Again, remember, that's why Nixon's put on the ticket with Eisenhower. Even though Eisenhower is the supreme commander of the Allies in Europe, Nixon is put on the ticket because he's more conservative and tougher on communism than Eisenhower. So his form of federalism dismantles New Deal programs and then shifts the burden of governance to the state level, right? With things like block grants, where it's not the federal government saying you need to allocate so much money for drug abuse and prevention, you need to allocate so much money for mental health facilities or for local health programs. It's rather just give the states a bunch of money and they do what they want with it. So this is, for example, a time period where, as increasingly money is given to California, California spends less and less on mental health programs and more on other things. And it's part of the reason we have such a large homeless population is actually the dramatic cutting back of mental health facilities and treatment in California. Families are not capable of providing the services that these facilities do. They cannot afford to pay for non-government subsidized care, and then people end up out on the street, right, with mental health issues. So all of this stuff is very much connected to our present moment. Again, another kind of progressive thing, he advocates for UBI, Universal Basic Income, so something recently made famous through Andrew Yang and the Freedom Dividend. This is an idea that Nixon had way back then. It doesn't happen. He does not pass that, but it is, again, a way of looking at Nixon, who is extremely conservative, but also had some policies that were fairly progressive: drug treatment and prevention, universal basic income. Things that happened during this time period: Congress passes Title IX, which, again, the main focus is protecting, providing equal access to sports and education stuff for women at the college level, but has a lot of other implications. and then Social Security being tagged to inflation, increasing with inflation. His political philosophy, again, neo-federalism. This is a Goldwater thing, anti-federal government, also anti-intellectual. You'll see a lot of contemporary politicians at the highest levels of office attacking the media, attacking liberal bias in the news, attacking egg-headed or pointy-headed academics who don't really know how things work. Nixon was a huge advocate of that kind of rhetoric, and he played it to the hilt. So very much part of his governing philosophy was attack, attack, attack. Southern strategy appeals to the silent majority. These are people who would have traditionally been Democrats, white Democrats in the South, who felt burned by civil rights legislation, white Democrats in the North, who, although they certainly benefited from liberal New Deal policies, once those policies started extending to African Americans, and their perception was that it was taking away rights from them. So again, as I said in my lecture on neoliberal discourse, this is a time period where people who are otherwise progressive when it comes to advancing their own personal benefits in the economy do not advocate for those when they're applied to others. And it plays on racial fears, Southern racial fears, Northern racial fears. This is happening at a time period where the tough on crime, anti-busing, anti-welfare, this all becomes stand-in or dog whistle terms for things about race. So a political dog whistle is when a politician is not specifically saying something, but the listener, if they want to hear it, understands that they are saying that thing. So when someone says, recently I saw an ad, it was someone running for some kind of position in outside of Atlanta. So it was a white conservative politician, and he was having a giveaway where, he was giving away an AR-15 if people did whatever, gave him money or something like that. And in the ad, he says, "Oh, you need these things to prevent, protect your property against looting hordes from Atlanta." That's a dog whistle, right? So that is the suggestion there is that the looting hordes are black people. The politician defended himself later in an interview and said, "Oh, it's not just Atlanta. It could be any place. It's not about race. It could be someplace like Baltimore or Ferguson." Again, places that are predominantly African American and have recently seen some urban unrest. So that is a dog whistle, right? That is someone not saying African Americans are going to come and rob you from the city, but rather, right, saying hordes from Atlanta. That's a political dog whistle. And things like being anti-busing, which Nixon was, which, in terms of contemporary politics, Joe Biden was also very much against busing. Anti-welfare, the assumption always, if someone says anti-welfare, it is often that people of color are on welfare, or getting, the inner city crime in the inner city is another kind of political dog whistle. Nixon's very good at that, and he plays it to his full advantage. Meanwhile, what's happening? Civil rights movements and social movements, in the kind of crest and crash of them, a political process that we would call hegemony. Some liberal demands are incorporated into the system, the demands that a majority support. So as that happens, that process happens, the more radical demands become rejected and they become more radical, right? So things that are seen as, common sense and good policy get incorporated into the system. And then the demands that are left are the radical demands, and political and social movements become more radical subsequently. Kent State, National Guard kill a student protester. That's a big problem. Again, a sign of the tensions around the Vietnam War. Stonewall Inn Rebellion, which is often cited as the beginning, quote unquote, of the gay rights movement. If you study this stuff at a higher level, it's not. There were other similar uprisings before Stonewall. The Compton Cafeteria riot in San Francisco. which was largely actually transgender protesters demanding rights and recognition in San Francisco. That's a year before Stonewall. But Stonewall is seen as the beginning in the historiography. This is, of course, again, to reflect on contemporary politics, ironic, because in one of the debates, and he got heat for this, in one of the debates, Pete Buttigieg said that he rejected the kind of radical social movements that Bernie Sanders advocated for from the 1960s. And then many people pointed out, excuse me, right, Pete Buttigieg, but gay rights is one of these radical movements. You were up on stage in a presidential debate because of a radical social movement like this. He deleted the tweet, though, so it's okay. The My Lai cover-up was also seen as a big controversy. How could the United States government or the military perpetrate something like this? There's tons of Americans whose vision of the United States Army is World War II, right? Storming the beaches at D-Day, taking on fascist Germany, fighting for freedom and democracy. So the kind of things that they see with My Lai really very much contradict those images. Pentagon Papers, Fall of Saigon, new immigration, all this stuff is happening, right? So this is the 70s, very much is the kind of, as I say here at the beginning, pardon the metaphor here, but it's the hangover of the 60s. The 60s are a time of jubilant protest, of expanding of civil rights, of the expansion of democracy in the franchise, things getting better and better for all kinds of groups of people, where the 1970s is the kind of hard realities. Kent State, My Lai, Pentagon Papers, Saigon. And there's some good things in there. New immigration starts to change the way the United States looks. And then the Burger Court, more conservative than the Warren Court, but still has some very big liberal decisions. Swain versus Charlotte Mecklenburg Board of Education says busing is legal. Busing is the taking of white students from affluent districts and shipping them to less affluent, often African-American districts, and then taking students from that district and sending them to the affluent districts. The idea here being all the students will help each other learn, right? So students from less advantaged districts in an advantaged district learn better, and then students from the advantaged district and the less advantaged district help everyone else learn better, and they can also potentially spread the wealth around in terms of taxes. Roe versus Wade, women's rights to choose and to have an abortion and to have that be legal at the national level. Again, Roe is about the national, abortion being legal nationally. It had been legal on a state-to-state basis before. Roe makes it national. And then United States versus Nixon, got to turn over those tapes, man. Environmental movement, happens in the 1960s and 70s. I'll put a link in here to a very famous ad, the quote-unquote crying Indian ad that kind of was a well-known environmental ad from this time period. And then Nixon, very quickly, and again, I appreciate the irony of me going over fast the most important element of his presidency, but you can study it on your own. It's in the book as well. Archibald Cox investigates. So he's a special prosecutor. So to think of contemporary politics, this is like Mueller, right? So Mueller was a special kind of an investigator. John Dean is an insider who testifies and says that Nixon was doing all these shady things. Haldeman and Ehrlichman resign in protest. They don't want to fire Archibald Cox. Spiro Agnew resigns for non-Watergate. He's being investigated for corruption when he was the governor of Maryland. Ford becomes VP. So again, the line of succession is president, vice president, and then Speaker of the House. That's what Gerald Ford is, or excuse me, majority leader, and that's what Gerald Ford is. So he is third in line. Saturday Night Massacre is when Nixon wants Elliot Richardson to fire Cox. Richardson resigns. There's a shift around. Rockleshaw resigns as well. And then Nixon and Solicitor General Robert Bork actually to fire him. Bork is later nominated under Reagan for a seat on the Supreme Court. That doesn't happen. Impeachment hearings begin in the Senate, and then he resigns. So this is a time period, as I've seen some political commenters remark with respect to the recent impeachment trials of the current president of the United States, that had Nixon had Fox News, had Nixon had social media, had Nixon had the internet and the ability to kind of speak directly to Americans, he probably wouldn't have resigned. This is a time period where the news media is certainly a lot more balanced than it is now. You can pick your partisan side and then just watch that kind of media. That is something that would have helped Nixon a lot. That was not even legal in this time period, right? So there was something called the Fairness Doctrine that demanded that news be balanced. And actually report in a very factual and balanced way. And that is actually, the Fairness Doctrine is repealed in 1975. So had Nixon had the kind of things that exist in 2020, it may have been a different story for him. Gerald Ford is sworn in. Here is I'm from Michigan. I can talk to you about how great a president Gerald Ford was, but it's also one of the things he's most famous or infamous for is falling down the steps. Poor fellow. So I'll have this GIF up here as I very quickly go through Ford's highlights. First, unelected president. So again, if a vice president becomes president, people voted for that person, right? That if you're on a presidential ticket as the VP, people are voting for you too. Not if you're Gerald Ford, majority leader, right? He's from Michigan. I'm from Michigan. So I guess that's all fine and well. He does pardon Nixon, but he also pardons draft dodgers. So people on the left hate him for this. People on the right hate him for that. It is a fairly balanced, unlike Ford's performance on the stairs here, a fairly balanced approach to trying to mend the country after the Vietnam War. He does survive 2 assassination attempts. Ford, again, we could have the debate here about most athletic president. But Ford probably, Teddy Roosevelt, we could say, sure, maybe. But Ford, there was a moment in college where he had to make a choice of either going to play professional football for the Green Bay Packers or going on to law school at Yale and pursuing his political career. So in terms of like athleticism resumes, in spite of this gift that is going on ad nauseum in the background, Ford's probably the most athletic. He deletes 86 pages out of the Rockefeller report, which detailed a lot of the nasty stuff the CIA was doing in terms of assassinating world leaders and supporting coup attempts. Dick Cheney is a major editor of that omission and redaction. More on him later. And then he falls down the steps. He loses to Jimmy Carter in 1976. So that is Ford's political, his presidency in a nutshell. He's also challenged, right, by Ronald Reagan in the primary in his reelection, and Reagan does not beat Ford in his challenge, but Reagan obviously will come back in 1980 to beat Carter. This is just some memorabilia, right? 76 was the bicentennial of the American Revolution, so there's all kinds of stuff celebrating that. Last slide here, Jimmy Carter, very quickly. Elected in the wake of Nixon, people are sick of the scandal, and Carter is a scandal-free guy. People actually so scandal-free that in an interview, and he was also very religious, an interviewer once asked him if he had ever cheated on Rosalind Carter, and he said that he had to admit that he had, quote, lusted in his heart, right? So that he had thought about it. And again, a lot of people thought this was kind of corny and funny, but it shows you the degree to which Carter was definitely not Nixon with respect to like his forthright and moral attitude. He's Southern, he's a moderate Dem, so this is why Carter can win the South and turn, again, these Southern states that had gone Republican back blue just for one election. From 1980 on, they stay pretty red. Bill Clinton turns a couple, but Clinton's also kind of quasi-Southerner. He's humble. He's idealistic. Again, is he naive? He thought he could march in there and disarm the military and move funding to domestic programs, undo all the follies of the Johnson administration in terms of moving money from domestic programs to war. He gets in there and realizes that that's not happening. Camp David Accords is a good win for him. Middle East peace, or an attempt at Middle East peace. The Iranian Revolution hostage crisis is bad. SALT II, right? So strategic arms limitation talks. The first round is Nixon. The second round is Carter. That's also good. And that is Jimmy Carter. And that is the 1969 to 1980 political scene in the United States.